presentation, and then I'll just at the end we'll have a brief discussion or whatever. We'll see ये कहाँ तक extend करेगा the discussion. So the topic I'm going to discuss today is consciousness and physics. As such, consciousness, if you study it, there are many dimensions to the consciousness. Before coming to the physics of and consciousness, I'll have a brief interlude, or I'll have a brief historical development of how the subject of consciousness has evolved and how it is being seen from different perspectives. The perspective being from neurosciences, perspective from artificial intelligence, and also a perspective from religion, philosophy, or theology, you can see it. And what are the pointers in which the contemporary study in consciousness has been taken up. And at the end, I'll try to see how we can relate the physics of consciousness in terms of mind-body problem, in terms of viewing consciousness through the perspectives of quantum physics, and quantum physics through consciousness. How we can study how we can try to understand the problem of consciousness. So to begin with, I would rather say, for example, how we define consciousness. Consciousness, normally we say it is called awareness of being aware, or you can say intimate presence of self-awareness. So where does this self-awareness come from? So it has historically, maybe before the 16th century, even before Greeks, so people had some view of how people become aware, or how their awareness is related with the larger awareness of the religions. So people from philosophy, people from religions, they had different opinions about how to relate the consciousness of the universe with the consciousness of human beings. So if you take a brief from 16th century, I would rather say the program of maybe how the contemporary science of maybe 16th century, the point where normally people take recourse to is how Descartes, when he famously said that I think I am. So he wanted to define consciousness as something it's a primal entity and which we cannot deny. So existence of being conscious in the Cartesian framework was considered essential in the beginning of how people try to study in the recent past, from last 500 years, how the subject of consciousness has been, how we perceive consciousness. And when we say it that way, so how it has evolved is that, for example, so it replicated the previous, the vitalistic, the spiritual or idealistic way of looking at consciousness. So how when this Descartesian idea was related with Newtonian worldview, which was entirely mechanistic in its manifestation, so the idea of consciousness was also seen the way in the Newtonian mechanics, or in Newtonian worldview, we see world as a machine. So there was a mechanistic view of consciousness. Consciousness was also thought of as a mechanistic process or phenomena to view it as such, which was not the way people in the earlier years tried to view it. So working on that very view of consciousness, how in late 19th century or 20th century, so consciousness can come from, for example, there are views of consciousness which come from neurobiology, they come from anthropology, they come from theology not of theology. One theology is the ancient Greek theology, in the contemporary theology, how people have modified theology with the latest developments in the different sciences. And you can also include mysticism, and you can also have a view of physics. So in the sense, so we'll try to see how maybe things have evolved. And so before coming to these very points of views, which are very, maybe they are very sophisticated in some sense, but what I would rather say is I'll give a brief history of in how 20th century the subject of consciousness has evolved. In 20th century, people, before the Second World War, there's something called logic of mind. So how the idea of consciousness is very much influenced by this perspective of logic of mind. So there was a subject called cybernetics. Maybe people from computer science may be knowing that it's not as such a subject. So there were problems in Second World War, people with how to best locate the artillery and to just pinpoint an aircraft. So there were many parameters involved, and how to optimize those parameters. So it was not only a problem of human psychology, it was also a problem, not only a problem of engineering, it was also a pure problem of human psychology. So historically, it's how the people who dealt with these very many issues, how to pinpoint an aircraft by an artillery. So they were people called cybernetics, a loose term. They were people from engineering, they were people from psychology. So historically, it's the way the subject was, the ingredients of subject were bringing up, and people from not only cybernetics, people from maybe there's something in subject called Gesalt psychology. Maybe Nisar people from psychology may be knowing things, seeing something as a whole. And there were certain scientists like Norbert Wiener, I need not to say von Neumann, and there were famous Mackay conferences. There were, just like we have conferences of consciousness conferences nowadays, they were Mackay conferences, in which people from cybernetics, people from mathematics, neuroscientists, person called McCulloch, anthropologists like Margaret Mead. So a lot of people came, physiologists, they came out and they wanted to address this problem in this new paradigm of how we can understand not only brain and consciousness, in the paradigm of people having different specializations, from cybernetics to engineering to psychiatry to psychology to maybe what I should say, anthropology, and different perspectives. There were a series of conferences. And from there, what people wanted to address is how the brain has this capacity of memory, how the brain, how our consciousness in terms of brain, how we have this capacity of unique adaptations, and how we can understand the other patterns of brain functioning, which may be purely deterministic and which may be purely mechanistic. So that was the point. So there was a deterministic and the mechanistic point of view, which was to be understood in the Fregean, how people try to understand the Cartesian mechanical, Descartesian way of looking at the world in a mechanistic way. So people wanted to understand brain or consciousness within those, with those hypotheses, within those, in that very framework. But here I would rather say people like von Neumann wanted to understand this brain phenomena more as a phenomenon of control as compared to von Norbert Wiener. And there was a person called Gregory Bateson. He has also a theory of mind. So he had maybe a perspective which was coming from joining of different streams of epistemology. How to basically maybe on the foundations, when you studying brain or consciousness from the foundations which are themselves evolving. They don't have a concrete foundation, whether in Cartesian framework or whether in a mechanistic framework. So this is the, so from these perspectives, our current understanding of how people try to understand the brain studies started for next 30 years. For example, when Neumann famously said that studies of human neural system lead to a model brain as a logic circuit. So trying to have an analogy of neuron with a logic circuit. So that was the defining moment. So trying to understand a conscious activity of a brain in terms of some computation of a processing of some unit, which led to the advent of digital computers, and maybe the analogy of brain and computer was left for 30 years. So famously, our understanding of brain or consciousness, it's heavily influenced by a computational aspect of how we understand, for example, a computer. It has an AI, it has a logical system, it has a processing thing, something called processing. It is a logical and computing thing, and there is information comes and it just processes something. Computer is understood like that in the earliest years. The brain model of thing was exactly taken from the developments in computer science, side by side. So next 30 years, people were very much heavily influenced or biased by this point of view of how people, and people from artificial intelligence have been heavily influenced, or they have taken this idea very much. I will not to just repeat, people know it better. So now comes how people from neurosciences, they also viewed how they tried, if there is trying to understand neurons or brain in terms of a neurophysiological process. So how do we understand consciousness? So consciousness, if it has purely materialistic origins, or there is a philosophy of materialism to understand consciousness. So, but materialistic understanding of consciousness can be reduced to physics. It can also be reduced to, it can have ideas from evolutionary biology, molecular biology, and real world. So it was a purely reductionistic way of looking at consciousness in material terms, and the process of mentation was accordingly trying to understand consciousness in terms of reductive materialism. So this is one thing. And maybe there is a one, I'm going to quote, not only materialists, there have been dualists, there have been idealists, there have been nowadays panpsychists. So apart from being hardcore materialists who wanted to define consciousness only in terms of material terms, there are people, there are philosophies, or there are frameworks in which material is not be all and end all of the things. Consciousness does not start or end at the material. Or consciousness may start with the material, but it may not end with the material. Or you start with something non-material, but you can explain consciousness as a material phenomena. So these are different ideas or frameworks in which we try to study consciousness. For example, I'll quote maybe 11. No, he's a philosopher. He says, brain is less materialized mind than spiritualized matter. In that context, maybe he's resonating an older statement of Bertrand Russell when he said that mind is less material, mental, and matter is less than material. When he famously advocated the idea of neutral monism, trying to understand matter and conscious mind in terms of some primal thing called neutral monism. Now we are coming to how to understand the practical problem. Then we have these ideas or these things trying to understand brain. So what are the practical problems of brain? For example, to understand brain, we know it has capacity of memory, it has unique adaptation to other patterns. So if you want to have a pure understanding in terms of purely materialistic, mechanistic and deterministic laws, so how to understand, if we understand brain through this paradigm. So here comes the famous problem of hard and soft problems of the brain. So hard and soft problems of the brain, maybe in terms of quantifying things, in terms of hard numbers, it's very easy. You have number, you can just, but when you have, for example, there are some qualia in what psychoanalysts call qualities, qualitative aspects of things. For example, I smell, I feel, I see the colors. So there is some subjective aspects of the things. So apart from the things which you can quantitatively just compute or in terms of numbers. So when here I'll quote the famous psychiatrist R.D. Lange when he said that when the program of Galileo started, so the mechanistic science quantified things, and out went the qualifying properties of smell, sound, feeling, sensibility. So the problem of hard and soft problem of consciousness, even though there are a lot of things like computational property of a brain, can we understand it in terms of computational property of some computer or processing device? You can make things. If a computer or a chess if we can make a computer, can it defeat a chess somebody, a grandmaster or something? So the computational capacity of brain in terms of machines, you could understand and replicate, but how to understand those very things in terms of mechanistic problem? So people have different idea. The paradigm of brain as a computer or metaphor, treating brain as a metaphor. So a lot of people have questioned this ideation or idea that brain as such cannot be treated as a metaphor. maybe even when we talk of quantities, for example, if the neuroscientists use, there are maybe 10 to the power 11 neurons in our brain, and each neuron has 10 to the power 3 maybe synapses. Synapses is the, maybe you might be knowing the connections. How that, so trying to understand even brain as purely electrical and chemical impulses. So the numbers they come out to be huge, and how is it possible that we are able to process information and all the things, how we can understand these things in terms of mechanistic and reductive manner? It's a very gigantic task, and maybe there are not enough models, or there have been people like Roger Penrose and other people, Hameroff, another person, they have worked together to thrash out some models. They have, how much they have been successful, it's also debatable. How the non-linear circuitry, non-linear functions of our brain, which is very coiled in a very complex patterns, how consciousness, can we explain the consciousness as a phenomena, not only the hard problems as well as the soft problems? So is the model right? Is the model right? So people like Roger Penrose, they are saying something, new physics is required, new physics is required, new physics is required, not because of computations or existing science or existing physical worldview, but we require, so he has his own way of looking at these things. So here comes now how to, if there is a huge problem of how we can have hard and soft problems, how can we, the mechanistic model of consciousness or the computational metaphor of consciousness, if it is not adequate to explain the things, so how to explain it? So there have been there have been frameworks which stem from idealism, materialism, dualism, panpsychism. So those maybe ideas, not all of them are mainstream. Apart from this, there are ideas from, for example, Eastern philosophy, which may include Greco-Islamic and Indian conversations. For example, in Islamic thing, for example, people like Imam Ghazali in Kubra. So they take consciousness not entirely physical. So they talk of physical and can relate physical with something higher. Or in, for example, Hindu traditions, we have chakra, we have Atman and Brahman, and you have wheels, so you have prana. So there are these ideas of which are there, how to try to imagine consciousness apart from being purely in terms of materialistic terms. So for example, so if physics cannot entirely explain, or the materialistic aspects of physics cannot entirely explain consciousness, this means we have to introduce God, or you have to invoke properties of God in the conscious material per se, to explain these properties of consciousness, which may not be, which is not necessarily mainstream. So, but people have they have these frameworks how to understand consciousness if it's not entirely a material mental activity. And in this perspective, I will rather say that so I come to the point where how in physics there are people like there are people like Don Page. There are many people who are working on consciousness. Maybe one person I just thought of talking of is David Chalmers. So he talks of consciousness. To understand consciousness, if there is a difficulty of understanding consciousness in purely materialistic and mechanistic terms, in terms of physicality, because of the huge problems of hard and soft problems of the brain. And even, for example, when we talk of brain, we talk of, for example, there are various limbic systems in the brain. For each activity, part of the brain has some specific functions, but it has been in certain experiments done in sleep research, trying to study neural connections, that things are not right. For example, left part of the brain is part involved in the analytical thinking and right part in the synthetic thinking, or vice versa. But it has been seen in certain functions you can crisscross It's not entirely that the left part is only involved in the analytical thinking and right part is only involved in the synthetic thinking. So things get crisscrossed. So every part of the brain is related with every other part of the brain as well as body. So the mind-body dualism, which is previously people try to understand it, that mind is something separate from body and everything happens in brain. So it has been also contested. Even though people say that a brain is the reservoir, everything comes and it gets integrated in our head, or which you call brain. But how it comes, people don't have a theory for it, how it comes exactly. So there is one interesting hypothesis of David Chalmers from the physics background. He says apart from there are some fundamental realities of nature, like there is space, there is time, there is matter, and he wants to introduce a fourth pillar to it, and he calls it consciousness. So, but so he says that consciousness, as such, we normally call it consciousness as an activity, as a phenomena or as an activity, which can even be replicated in machines. If people from Marvin Minsky, people from artificial intelligence will have that point of view, but he says that consciousness should be taken as an independent parameter apart from these three parameters: space, time, and matter. So this means that consciousness as such cannot be located in the particular part of the brain as such. So it's part of the entire universe. But he is not entirely saying that consciousness, there is some outer reality outside the consciousness as a phenomena should be understood something outside it, maybe God or higher being or Atman. So consciousness as a phenomena, how do we become consciousness? So is it a merely emergent property of synapses of neural circuits at some stage that people get conscious, or so it is some fundamental property of the universe? So here maybe people have opinions and different things. So here I would I'll just try to connect it with something called maybe. No, there are nowadays non-local interpretations of quantum mechanics. So to give you a brief idea, in physics we have two fundamental theories. One is quantum mechanics, another is general theory of relativity. As of now, we have not been able to have a satisfactory theory to unify both of them. So people want to believe that there is a fundamental theory of quantum mechanics at some fundamental level needs to be modified. So there come many viewpoints, like how in Copenhagen interpretation of physics is that the idea of observer becomes very much relevant in the quantum mechanical idea of things, because the act of observing is going to disturb observer in a significant way. So in the words of Niels Bohr, in the drama of existence, we are ourselves actors and spectators. So this is the quandary, or this is the paradox of quantum mechanics, that the observer is going to change what is going to get observed. So in this process, how the fundamental process of consciousness, if the observer is somewhat as a relevant as a figure. So in a quantum mechanical reality, you cannot have one reality. There can be, you have a probability. Reality is probabilistic. So if it is probabilistic, you can have all sort of probabilities which can for an observer to just choose among them. So in the same way, the origin of consciousness, it can be taken as a conscious activity in which the non-local interactions or somehow one is the local, the other is non-local. Non-local means things are simultaneously connected. Different parts of the universe are connected in an innate way. So consciousness as a phenomena, if you take, there is a reality, we take a fundamental reality of physics in terms of quantum physics, and quantum physics is a non-local, and in terms of non-local physics. So the phenomena of consciousness is not merely information processing. It's how the theory of space, time, and matter can be integrated with the idea of consciousness. So in space, time, and matter means the quantum theory, or how we try to understand space and time. And maybe the one another thing is that maybe a lot of people are saying that if we have a conscious observer, is universe conscious of its own self? So if the universe has started at some point in time in Big Bang, so if the moment of origin of universe was at some point, a finite time in universe, 16 billion years or so, so universe started from that very point. So mind has capacity to think before the universe. Means mind as such is conscious of something, just like it's conscious of some non-local physics. For example, we start, the idea of space and time can start when the universe started. But mind has a capacity to go beyond that very thing. Something is innate in it. So these are speculative ideas. So from that you can also deduce that the idea of consciousness is prior to the idea of matter. So maybe you can say, for example, in a pantheistic philosophy, the idea of Brahman and Atman. So there's a consciousness behind every consciousness. Or God as a creator, you can also take it like he is the creator of monastic religions. He is the creator of that consciousness. Or mind itself is conscious, and the consciousness is it exists or predates the existence of matter. So these are speculative ideas from philosophy, from religion, from theology. So it's a very random lot of, there are not hard and fast rules. Things have gone from. So people, they do, even though there are hardcore empiricists, materialists, idealists, there are monists also, and so these are different researchers who just try to understand consciousness from different perspectives. So there's a hardcore computational way of looking at consciousness, where people talk of consciousness as mere as one of the activity, as a process. People from artificial intelligence, people from computer science. And there are neuroscientists who have a biological view of consciousness, and there are philosophers also, and there are physicists also who link the consciousness of the mind with the consciousness of the universe, and there are theologians also. So, and there's also a viewpoint that taking consciousness as a fundamental reality apart from taking space, time, and matter. So maybe, so here I'll stop. I think so. So if it's just a sufficient place to stop. So if you want to ask anything, like whatever. So if I can understand, if I can explain whatever I know. Consciousness is, there is a theory, but there are different perspectives of theory. Yes. But you can explain a lot of things, like people from neuroscience, people.
As per the quantum physics concern, I think quantum physics is very much close to that extent. As for the physics is concerned, I think physics can define this consciousness. As for the bioscience is concerned, अगर हम बायोसाइंस की बात करें उसमें भी हो सकता है, बट मुझे लगता है कि फिजिक्स के एतबार से ज़्यादा समझाया जा सकता है ना.
you're right.
है ना, फिजिक्स के एतबार से इसको ज़्यादा समझाया जा सकता है. We can understand better.
Exactly. नहीं, there is not a hard and fast rule. मतलब आर्टिस्ट भी आ सकते हैं आज की डेट में. इसका है ना नॉन लोकल इन्फ्लुएंस भी. People from theology can come. There are some aspects of consciousness वो जरूरी materialistic हो. So इसको हम कैश नहीं कर सकते, जो हमारा अप्रोच ही गलत हो सकता है.
अच्छा था, it was a good wonderful lecture, and मुझे लगा कि बहुत कुछ सीखने को मिला.
चलो चलो ठीक नहीं नहीं आई जस्ट
Exactly. CJ, especially left brain and right brain. Left brain is concerned with the analytical and right brain statistical.
हाँ नहीं उसमें है ना उन्होंने बहुत सारे एक्सपेरिमेंट्स किए ना ये इपिलेप्टिक सीजर्स है ब्रेन में यहाँ पर तो उसमें दिखाया गया कि इफ देयर सम कट ऑपरेशन में सर्जरी में हो जाता है सो इट हैज बीन सीन कि फॉर एग्जांपल अगर कट होता है सर्जरी में यहाँ पर लेफ्ट साइड के न्यूरॉन्स एंड राइट साइड के न्यूरॉन्स इट हैज नॉट बीन ऑलवेज लाइक दैट सो फिर जो हमारी वो थ्योरी है ना मतलब ब्रेन इज मेड ऑफ कंपार्टमेंट्स ये हियरिंग के लिए ये टच के लिए ये इसके लिए है ये सेंसिबिलिटी के लिए सो बट इवन इफ अगर हमने कोई फंक्शन इसको असाइन किया है बट इवन इफ जब वो ब्रेन पार्ट ऑफ द ब्रेन हैज बीन डैमेज्ड बट इवन इफ देयर आर सम फंक्शंस व्हिच वी हैड थॉट ऑफ ये इस फंक्शन की बट स्टिल देयर आर कुछ फंक्शंस वो स्टिल कर रहा है दिस मीन्स ये फंक्शन जो हम थ्योरी थी कि इट्स लोकलाइज्ड एट हियरिंग इज हियर इट्स नॉट एग्जैक्टली दैट वे
I think we are lacking some knowledge about this. I think we are lacking. We are not up to that. We have not reached it up to that extent at which we can understand consciousness in a better way.